Senator.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak today on this bill. It's a bill that was crafted to ensure that public funds are invested ethically and not counter to the wishes of the Australian community, invested in a way that doesn't undermine Australian public policy. It's an idea whose time has come. It's not a controversial idea, and it's why I've brought this bill to the parliament. The bill sets out to improve the Future Fund. The Future Fund was created in 2006 in order to set aside money to cover the government's unfunded superannuation liabilities. It's currently got about $80 billion under management, and it's expected to grow to about $140 billion by 2020. The Future Fund's already the 13th largest sovereign wealth fund, with the other nation-building funds being the Building Australia Fund, the Education Investment Fund and the Health and Hospitals Fund, which add another $17 billion to the total. It's a lot of money in anyone's book, and investing it's a very important task. It's big enough to move money markets, and that's why the fund's investments are overseen by a board of guardians who are independent of government. I'll talk about that more in a moment. We agree that the fund must remain independent of government. We know that when the returns do eventuate, we want the money to be there, soundly and prudently invested. But at the same time, we acknowledge that a pool of this size has a lot of power, and the power could be used for good, for neutral purposes, or it can also be used to do harm. Now, the Greens don't think the Future Fund should be a primary vehicle for creating social change. We understand that it's proper and right that the fund be a neutral actor in the financial markets, able to make long-term investment decisions independent of political agendas. But what if the fund's investments are actively creating harm? As a responsible government, we are obliged to ensure that any harm we're causing is minimised, whether that be direct or indirect harm, and that's what this bill does. It does not give government veto power over all investment decisions. It merely obliges the Future Fund to consider potential harms when making investments. It's not an abstract concept. We believe that some of the fund's investments are already causing harm. They're doing so by supporting and profiting from industries that have a strong negative impact on the well-being of Australian citizens and citizens right around the world. So which of those investments are problematic? The most glaring example is tobacco. At last count, the Future Fund had over $210 million invested in tobacco. It includes $55 million in British American tobacco, $44 million in Philip Morris and $48 million in Lorillard. A horrifying set of numbers. Australia's been a world leader in tobacco control. The government are to be congratulated for the leadership they've shown in this area, and I was proud to support the plain packaging legislation that came to this parliament last year. It will save lives, and it was only last month that it survived a High Court challenge, a challenge that came from these very same companies that we're investing in. The fund's investing in companies that sued the Commonwealth for the right to more efficiently kill its citizens. Tobacco kills 15,000 Australians every year. It costs the country over $30 billion per annum in direct and indirect costs. It includes $600 million on direct hospital costs, which is just the beginning of the burden it puts on the health system. The situation's worse overseas, and it's getting more serious by the day. Almost a third of men still smoke worldwide, and it's a habit that will kill half of them. It's in the developing world that tobacco use is on the rise. We've got laws that are lax, unrestricted advertising and very low taxes, and the real growth industry is in young people. Every day, up to 100,000 young people start smoking somewhere in the world. Indonesia has a famous customer, a young boy who, at the age of 4 years, has a pack-a-day habit. It might seem sensational, but he's not alone. 2% of smokers start at the age of 4 in that country, and many more begin by the age of 10. It's no surprise that the filters on these cigarettes have sweetened tips. When those tobacco shares pay dividends, this is where the money is coming from. Since I started this speech, many more people will have died. As a medical practitioner, I have seen the pain and suffering and fear in a person's eyes when they're told they will die because of their addiction to nicotine. It kills people and it destroys families, and it's no wonder the medical profession is so strongly in support of this bill. It's important to look a little bit at the industry itself, this industry that we are investing in. Since its creation, its primary objective was to manufacture doubt around its own product. So it relied heavily on scientists, with guidance from industry lawyers and PR experts, to manufacture doubt about its product. These guns for hire, some of them willing, who believe that any regulation in the marketplace was a bad thing, even if people were dying, caused many more people to suffer. We've now seen millions of pages of documents released during tobacco litigation which demonstrates the links between parts of the scientific community and the PR community, and they show the crucial role that these guns for hire played in sowing doubt between the links around the links between smoking and cancer. It's interesting that the same sort of strategy, the tobacco strategy, has been applied to a number of other issues, including environmental issues like global warming. The industry's position was that there was no proof that tobacco was bad, and they manufactured a debate convincing the media that it had an obligation to present both sides of the debate. They made sure the industry got facts. The so-called Balance campaign involved aggressive dissemination and promotion to editors and publishers of information that supported the industry's position. The appeal to journalistic balance, as well as perhaps the industry's large advertising budget, resonated with writers and editors right around the world. They produced junk science to undermine peer-reviewed real science, and much like global warming, they were successful. In 1964, when the Surgeon General in the United States produced a report that unequivocally said that smoking was bad for people and that it killed them, a report based on 7,000 scientific studies, you would assume that the industry would have said, "We're beat." But no. How did it respond? More denial. The industry stated, "There is no scientific evidence that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer or other disease," a case of white is black and black is white. They fought harder. They redoubled their efforts to challenge the science. They changed the name of their industry fund to the Tobacco Research Council, or Council for Tobacco Research, dropping the word industry. They funded many more hand-picked scientists, and they sponsored a number of medical institutions. When, in 1965, Congress decided to put warnings on tobacco packages and advertisements, the tobacco industry responded with a parade of dissenting doctors. I quote. In 1969, when the American Communications Commission decided to ban cigarette advertising, again the industry responded with, I quote, "There is no demonstrated causal relationship between smoking and lung cancer." They ultimately were found guilty of lying, in part because the trail of PR documents showed very clearly that the tobacco industry knew the dangers of smoking as early as 1953 and conspired to suppress that knowledge. They conspired to fight the facts and to merchandise doubt, in the words of one author. But it took a long time for those facts to emerge, and in the intervening years, when the community believed that there was reasonable doubt around the harms of smoking, people died. It wasn't until the 1990s that the industry began to lose court cases, and it wasn't until 2009 that in the United States, tobacco was finally regulated as an addictive product, more than half a century after the tobacco industry themselves knew of the damage they were causing. Now, the international community would applaud us for divesting of tobacco, and we have an obligation to do so. We have signed on to a framework convention on tobacco control, which states very clearly that parties, and I quote, should not invest in the tobacco industry and related ventures. Full stop. Despite all of this, there are people in the investment community who say that tobacco is a good investment, that profits in the developing world are growing, and that many people, especially women, remain unaddicted. But the reality is that tobacco is a sunset industry. The trail of death that it leaves in its wake makes it an unsustainable business. We simply can't afford to continue investing in this industry. We can't support it. It's unthinkable that we send any more public funds their way. Funds that come at the profits of, at the expense of their victims. It's irresponsible. It undermines our work on tobacco control and makes a mockery of our treaty obligations. It's unsustainable, unethical, and the public want it to stop. Now, tobacco is one part of the Future Fund where we must divest ourselves, but it's not the only one. The fund has substantial investments in companies that make nuclear weapons. According to analysis by the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, the fund has over $133 million invested in companies involved in this industry. Given Australia's goal of a world without nuclear weapons, it's hard to see how these investments don't put us in a position as absurd as our position is with tobacco. The fund's investments also risk a conflict with our important foreign aid programs. As we invest in combating non-communicable diseases in the Pacific, the companies we invest in are selling people their cigarettes. As we invest in and push for human rights, labour rights and stronger environmental protections in our region, we're investing in companies that are exploiting workers and bulldozing rainforest in those countries. This bill makes it plain as to the reason we need ethical investment guidelines. The bill directs the Minister to provide some ethical investment guidelines to the fund. It would mean that the fund would be obliged to consider the investments they make against a set of guidelines to be developed by the Minister in conjunction with the fund. The fund already has some limits on what it can invest, in. They can't invest in businesses that are illegal in Australia, no matter how profitable they may be. You might make money out of investing in a cocaine cartel or gun running, but it's good to know that Australian taxpayer dollars are not going to fund it. And it's worth noting that the fund has already divested itself of some investments for this very reason. Because Australia is a signatory to the Convention on Cluster Munitions, manufacturing or deploying these bombs would be illegal here. So the fund divested itself of these stocks, divested itself of the companies that make these deadly weapons. This is, as it should be, and I congratulate the fund for taking that decision. The divestment sets an important and welcome precedent. The government didn't tell the fund to get out of cluster munitions. They made that decision as one that is compatible with their mandate and their responsibilities. It is true that the government can't tell the fund what to invest in. The Board of Guardians manage the portfolio and don't take orders from the Minister on whether any investment is good, bad, either in the long term or the short term, whether it's ethical or unethical. However, the fund does take some direction from the government. This is by way of the investment mandate. Under the Act, the relevant ministers may provide the board written guidance and indeed must do so. The current mandate, invested in 2006, specifies the returns the fund should aim for and the level of risk to take. And it states that the board must have regard to international best practice with regard to corporate governance, including its voting policy. Unfortunately, the mandate does not also state that the fund must balance its quest for returns with investment policies that do not harm Australia and the world. and I've got no reason to believe that it couldn't do that. Nevertheless, the mandate does provide an example of government direction that is hands-off and divorced from everyday investment decisions. Given that the board must consider the mandate when devising an investment strategy, they could also have some guidelines around an approach to responsible investment, and that's what this bill does. It doesn't go into any detail about the ethical investment guidelines that the board must follow. It's up to the minister and could be as simple as instructions that the fund must follow world's best practice regarding the ethical implications of its investment. The bill, however, does specify that some investments should, at a minimum, be covered by the guidelines and that the fund should divest itself of these investments. They are tobacco, cluster munitions and nuclear weapons. It's not a long list. In fact, it's a very short one, and it could operate in the same way as the investment mandate currently does, at arm's length from the government. It's not an unusual thing for a sovereign wealth fund to do. There are precedents right around the world. Government and non-government institutions, our funds, are increasingly developing responsible and ethical investment practices that are very robust and yet do not compromise the returns that funds are making. Norway's government pension fund, for example, is a sovereign wealth fund similar to the Future Fund. It's leading the world in this area. They've gotten out of tobacco, divested themselves of stock in mining companies, and nuclear weapons are out. Yet, by all accounts, the fund does well. In our own region, the New Zealand Superannuation Fund has had a responsible investment policy for some time. They began divesting of tobacco in 2007 and cluster bombs in 2008. And there are precedents here in Australia. To their credit, the ACT government, in large part due to pressure from the Greens, just last month put in place guidelines that will see it divest itself of tobacco, cluster bombs and landmines. New South Wales may be next. And in the private sector, there's also momentum. In July, First State Super announced they've excluded tobacco companies from their portfolios. There is ample precedent for what this bill sets out to do. If anything, Australia's nation-building funds are lagging behind. The fund claims to have policies that already do this, that are sufficient. They claim a rigorous ownership rights and environmental, social and governance policy. But in their evidence given to the inquiry into this bill, they claim that they use their power as investors to work with companies and improve their record on these issues. I'm not an expert in this field of investment, but I do fail to see how a policy can be sufficient, let alone best practice, if we've got $1/3 billion invested in tobacco and nuclear weapons. Of course, the fund have raised the issue of independence, and as I've said previously, I do believe that independence is important and appropriate. But I remain unconvinced that a set of guidelines would somehow compromise this independence. I appreciate that investments are complex and it may add some small complexity to our relationships with third-party fund managers, but it's a small price that's worth paying. We understand that the fund, through this bill, should be consulted, and it will be. I'd be perfectly happy to see the fund consulted and it itself develop some guidelines around its ethical investment responsibilities. The bill makes it explicit that this should happen. I note that if the bill is passed, it won't cause any disruption to the fund, and that the existing portfolio has 12 months to dispose of any important investments that conflict with the new guidelines. Look, this legislation would resolve the preposterous conflict that exists between the Future Fund's global investments and Australia's global tobacco reform agenda. It brings Australia up to par with world's best practice regarding responsible and ethical investment. And that's the problem that brings us here today. The Future Fund should be at arm's length, but it's public money invested and it's a public institution. And that fact alone obliges us to consider the implications of its actions. It's a tool that exists to achieve a specific aim, to take a liability off the budget books. The fund should be independent, but only as independent as it needs to be to meet this goal. It should seek profits only so far as they help to balance the ledger. And if we can't do that without causing harm in other countries, how can we endorse this enterprise? Luckily, the choice is easy. A responsible investment is not contrary to profitable investment, and this bill finally aligns both of those goals.
Time's expired for the debate.